It all began on a nervous Monday morning. The sort of morning that curls your stomach with excitement, where each breath weighs more than the one before, and even the sunlight dawdles in breaking through the clouds. Outside the courtroom, there had been a crowd assembled, murmuring to each other, cameras at the ready, phones aloft, all vying for the first sight of what would prove to be one of the most sensational trial spectacles in recent history. Journalists pushed against each other, microphones protruding like mechanical appendages, eager to hear every word, every expression. It was not a typical legal hearing. This was a drama, a tale long in the making behind the closed doors of corruption, and all eyes were on the event awaiting its dramatic unfolding. Inside, too, it was equally charged. The courtroom doors, gleaming and massive, seemed to shut the world outside away, enclosing within a bubble where celebrity from reality television met real-world repercussions. Attorneys rustled papers anxiously, clerks exchanged hushed whispers, and bailiffs bustled about with the practiced ease of individuals who were used to routine. But even they could not suppress the tension in the room. All eyes were focused on the doorway, anticipating the presence whose coming alone was able to command an entire room, Kody Brown. When Kody stepped in, the room held its collective breath. He walked with the ease of a man who had stood in front of cameras his whole life. But there was something different this time. His charismatic smile was subdued, replaced by an intense seriousness that promised the gravity of what lay ahead. His eyes, cold and calculating, searched the room, taking in the press, the crowd, the judge, the opposing sides, but beneath the calm demeanor, the tension was palpable. With each movement, it seemed he was measured, calculated, as if he were traversing a tightrope with no net to catch him if he fell. For those who only knew Kody through TV, it may have looked like just another dramatic day of a reality show star. But today was different. Today the scripts had been left behind. The producers weren't orchestrating. The cameras were there, maybe, but they weren't dictating. Here, the stakes were real. Here, money, reputation, and family dynamics were in the dock. And the world watched. The court itself appeared to thrum with tension. The wooden benches, which were usually humble, now served as judges' platforms. The walls, adorned with portraits of austere judges, appeared to bow forward, studying every action, every gesture. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and expectation, a combination that made each heartbeat sound more keen, more noticeable. Each whisper, each shuffling step was magnified, as though the room itself was leaning forward in an effort to hear the slightest suggestion of what would occur next. As Kody walked toward the defendant's chair, the cameras clicked and whirred uninterrupted. Reporters wrote frantically, attempting to record the initial responses, while spectators tilted their heads, hoping to catch a glimpse of the figure at the eye of this hurricane. He sat down, smoothing his suit with precise care, his hands clasped in front of him on the table. His posture had a stillness that spoke of mastery, but the tiny crease in his brow gave away the underlying tension. He was ready to meet what was to come, yet even he could not quite shake the seriousness of the moment. The judge entered, and with her presence, the room seemed to constrict. Judges have the ability to command attention without loudness, of transforming even the most disheveled room into a space of gravity. The murmurs dissipated at once as she sat, her gavel ready like a sentinel. Her gaze swept the courtroom, encompassing participants, witnesses, camera crews, recognizing, perhaps, the double nature of this trial. It was both a matter of law and a show trial. And in that look, Kody bore the burden of responsibility bear down, heavier than any limelight, heavier than any camera. The ex-wives, arrayed on the far side, were a contradiction in terms. One seemed determined, jaw clenched and eyes burning with determination, ready to unveil all the secrets and call for justice regardless of what would come her way. The other seemed quieter, nervous but steadfast, her hands folded rigorously in her lap as she prepared herself for what lay ahead. Among them, stacks of papers and evidence suggested the rich financial and personal entanglement that had brought them to this day. They were a quiet reminder of the stakes, the broken promises, the betrayed trust, and the lives that had become complicated in ways that were now about to be exposed before the world. The bailiffs dispersed the last of the murmurs from the crowd, and a hush fell over the gathering. It was the sort of silence that's almost palpable, alive, charged with possibility, the sort that comes just before something momentous. Kody's attorney leaned in for a moment, whispering words of comfort, strategies, reminders. Kody hardly heard them. His attention was inward, reviewing scenarios, assessing possibilities, getting ready for moments that could set the course of the rest of his life. Every corner of the courtroom was like a tale waiting to be told. The audience, the media, the lawyers, even the observers, were trapped in a frozen moment where reality was mixed with show. The world waited outside, watching live feeds, reading breaking news, following every development on social media. Millions would witness what transpired in the coming hours, analyze each utterance, each look, and each gesture. And Kody Brown, the man who'd lived so much of his life before cameras, was suddenly held to account not only by public opinion, but by the serious, implacable eye of the law. The clock ticked, slow and measured, each passing second building the tension. Kody corrected his posture, smoothed his tie, took a deep breath. The truth of it hit him full force. This wasn't a television set. No retakes, no editing, no producers instructing him how to respond. Each word, each movement, each choice counted. He wasn't acting for numbers now. He was living with the repercussions of his actions, the culmination of decades of complicated relationships, business and personal choices. And then, as if the universe had decided the time had come, the judge spoke. Her voice, steady but authoritative, rang across the room. "We are now in session." The sentence remained suspended in the air, heavy and deliberate, signaling the beginning of a trial that would reveal secrets, test reputations, and leave its imprint on all concerned. Cameras snapped, pens scratched, and Kody Brown sat forward slightly, bracing himself for what no one could forecast. It was the start of a day that would be remembered for years, a day when reality met responsibility, drama encountered justice, and one man's decisions would finally catch up with him. The world was smaller at that moment, tension greater, and the tale waiting to unfold. Each heartbeat, each look, each whisper in the court was a lead-in to a story that would stun, astound, and hold the audience in its grip like nothing else. Kody Brown's life, bared before millions, was going to make a turn no one could possibly have anticipated. And as the trial finally got underway, one thing was certain: no one in this courtroom, or outside it, would ever forget the tension, the drama, and the sheer suspense of this shocking start. The tension that had been building in the courtroom only grew more intense as the first phrases of the case resonated through the air. The atmosphere was heavy, almost claustrophobic, as the specifics of the charges began to emerge. What had begun as gossip on the outside of the courtroom was now a fact that everyone could see and hear. Kody Brown, familiar to millions as the reality television star, whose life was never private, now stood accused of things that struck much closer to home. Accusations that not only threatened his own reputation, but the very fabric of his family and finances. The first ex-wife stood, her fingers lightly shaking as she held the edge of the witness stand. Her voice was soft at first, but with each statement grew stronger. "I trusted him," she started, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I trusted him to bring security, to be responsible, and to honor the vows he made to us. But in time, I came to see that wasn't the truth." The courtroom was hushed except for the sound of clicking pens and the occasional crinkle of paper. All forward, riveted by the tale being told, unable to take their eyes away. She set out the charges carefully, each word more weighted than the last. She talked of financial management, of choices that impacted not only her, but their children and their relatives. Bills would go unpaid at times, she went on, funds intended for the needs of our children went elsewhere. We were left with nothing but doubt, always wondering if we could trust him. Every word did ring out in the courtroom, resonating off the walls, touching no part of the space untouched by the force of her allegations. The second wife was next, her method being different but no less convincing. She looked calm at first, but the fire in her eyes showed years of frustration, pain, and betrayal. She testified of emotional pressure, of sleepless nights worrying about money, and of repeatedly feeling in the dark. It was not just the money, she stated strongly, her voice unshaking. It was the lies, the broken promises, and the feeling that we were never really seen or taken into consideration in the things that impacted our lives. The courtroom audience sensed the tension build with every word, the air in the room thick with anger, sympathy, and disbelief. Kody sat quietly, listening, his face relaxed, but his eyes betraying a glimmer of discomfort. He had stood in front of cameras hundreds of times, endured public scrutiny, and been put in the most sensational circumstances possible. But this was different. This wasn't ratings or scripted television. This was about truth and accountability. Each accusation sent a weight pressing down from all directions, feeling personal. Even for a man seasoned in the reality TV world, this was an examination unlike any other, a challenge of character and credibility. The attorneys for the ex-wives presented facts methodically, one document at a time, creating a sensational picture of alleged financial misconduct. Bank statements, receipts, and contracts were arrayed before the judge and jury for their inspection. The account was specific and incriminating, specifying not only amounts of money, but choices that had an impact on the very stability of several families. With the introduction of each piece of evidence, murmurs passed through the crowd. Everyone present in that room could sense the stakes rising higher and higher with every second, the tension swelling like a storm about to burst. Questions were being posed to him, at times blunt and sometimes veiled, questioning his past choices, his judgment, and his culpability. The court was poised with its breath in every response. Kody's composure was unbroken, but his jaw tightening ever so slightly, his blinking every now and then gave away his inner conflict. He was walking through a maze of suspicions, facts, and emotional witnesses, and the world was waiting with bated breath. Each document, each pause, would be questioned, analyzed, and broadcast far beyond that courtroom. The tales of the ex-wives started converging, showing a pattern that was difficult to disregard. His defense attorneys rose, a calm collective of lawyers, whose presence was enough to emanate strength. They had spent weeks preparing for this, poring over financial reports, watching timelines, and preempting every potential claim that could be filed against their client. But even with extensive preparation, the nervousness in the room was palpable. This was not merely a case of law. It was a war of perception, reputation, and credibility. The slightest error could shift the momentum irretrievably. The head lawyer cleared his throat, a noise that seemed to echo through the courtroom, demanding everyone's attention. Your Honor, members of the court, the charges made here today, though emotionally charged, do not entirely represent the truth of the matter, he started. His tone was calm, measured, and deliberate, a far cry from the charged environment of the ex-wives' testimonies. Mr. Brown has acted in good faith in all financial matters, providing for his family and making decisions that, while complex, were made with transparency and care. Kody listened quietly, his hands folded neatly on the table, his expression composed. Inside, however, his mind raced. He had lived much of his life under the intense scrutiny of public eyes, but this was different. Reality TV drama might be edited, stories might be constructed, and responses staged. This was raw, unvarnished reality, the kind in which one misstep might leave a lasting impact on both his private and professional life. Still, he kept his cool demeanor, knowing that appearing confident at the moment was as important as the actual legal arguments. The lawyer went on, producing charts, receipts, and documents to explain the defense. Here we have a scrupulous accounting of financial disbursements, he explained, pointing to individual figures. Money was dispersed with purpose and foresight. Decisions which would seem dubious at face value were actually made with the concurrence of all those who had an interest in the matter, including deals made mutually. The courtroom audience cocked heads, some squinting at the papers, others leaning in to whisper to neighbors. The story was changing, and all could feel the depth of the situation complicating. Kody's other lawyer then spoke to the emotional part of the charges. Although personal complaints are valid, they must not take precedence over facts, she asserted. Mr. Brown has acted at all times for the best interests of his children, rendering material support as well as emotional counsel. The claims of betrayal, while dramatic, are not fully supported by the evidence presented. Her voice carried authority, and for the first time, a slight murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the room. The courtroom tension didn't disappear. It thickened, but now it was layered with uncertainty. Kody finally spoke, though briefly, leaning slightly forward and addressing the court with a calm, deliberate tone. "I know the fears and anger of my former wives," he replied, selecting each word with precision. "I have always done what I thought was in the best interest of my family. Disasters may have happened, as they do in any multifaceted family situation, but there was never an intention to deceive or hurt. I have always worked to establish stability, security, and love for my children and family." The courtroom was hanging on his every word, the difference between his calm demeanor and tearful testimonies now stark and undeniable. The defense team hoped that the emotional impact of the allegations could sway opinion, so they deliberately changed tactics to emphasize Kody's long-term commitment and responsibilities. "Look at the regularity with which Mr. Brown has provided support for his children in several households," the senior attorney pleaded. "Financial planning, legal compliance, and logistical hurdles are part of his daily routine. The accusations made before us do not fully explain the intricacy of dealing with a large and extended family system. His conduct was consistently directed at balance and equity." As the attorneys presented testimony, there was a faint but discernible change in atmosphere. Witnesses on Kody's behalf came forward, providing details of daily life, money matters, and domestic organization. A former aide testified to the detail with which he planned, and a family friend spoke of his attempts to ensure every child had attention, care, and support. The courtroom, previously dominated by recrimination and indignation, now became a place where subtleties came out, bringing to light the complicated layers of Kody's existence that were not visible to the public. The defense also pointed out inconsistencies in the charges. Some of the claims, cross-checked with bank statements, legal contracts, and chronologies, seemed inflated or misstated. With every disclosure, the story gained a new dimension, compelling observers to re-evaluate initial hypotheses. The audience in the courtroom, media, relatives, and passers-by alike, experienced the tension swing from skepticism, curiosity, and fascination. No longer was this a matter of betrayal. It was a complex knot of choices, viewpoints, and humanity. At some point, the judge interrupted, her tone even but authoritative, requesting clarification on certain financial transaction points from the defense. Kody's lawyer answered with clarity, laying out context, dates, and reasons for every transaction. The judge nodded ponderingly, taking notes. For the first time since the trial had started, there was a feeling that both sides were being balanced, that the truth was being tested beyond the flash of headlines and public opinion. Kody relaxed, giving himself a small, barely perceptible sigh. The defense had accomplished what it had set out to do: make a case as good as possible, balancing emotion and fact. As the hearing went on, Kody's tranquility became the hallmark of the day. Where his former wife's testimony had created a rich and emotive picture, Kody's calm answers and the orderly reasoning of his defense attorneys presented an equally powerful counter-narrative. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, not just with rage, but with tension born of dueling truths. Each viewer felt the gravity of every word, the tension of every debate, and the ominous suspense of what the ruling would eventually tell. At the day's end, the courtroom had been treated to a dramatic dance between accusation and defense. Kody Brown, the man who had spent so much of his life on television, had revealed a rarely seen side of himself, calm, articulate, and unshakable in the face of adversity. But under the placid surface, the weight of the evidence was still there. Every decision, every accusation, and every refutation would be picked apart in the days to follow. The defense had struck a blow, but the emotional power of the ex-wife's accusations lingered, the fulcrum of a finely balanced judgment which the judge would have to carefully unravel. As the court rose for the day, Tension outside the courtroom was no less intense. Journalists theorized endlessly. Twitter was abuzz with speculation, and supporters argued every detail of Kody's words. Back inside, Kody exited the courtroom slowly, keeping his cool, but knowing that the days to come would require even greater resolve. He'd given his defense, pushed back against claims, and emphasized the nuances of his home life. But the trial was only half over. The true test of perception, credibility, and truth had only just begun, and everyone, including the judge and the public, would be waiting on bated breath. This day had established a new tempo for the trial. It was no longer merely a tale of scandal. It was a tale of strategy, grit, and the complex choreography between perception and truth. Kody Brown had entered the battle not as a passive actor, but as an active one, making his way through a maze of legal, emotional, and public hurdles. And as Monday's tense sunset approached, the world stood by, mesmerized, to wait and see what the next installment of this historic courtroom saga would bring. The courtroom was quiet once more. But this quiet carried a burden much heavier than that of yesterday. The air seemed almost electric, as if every seat, every corner of the room, had absorbed the tension and was now ready to release it through the voices of those who had been hurt the most. The emotional testimony was about to start, and all knew that this was when the trial would shift from cold facts and figures to the raw, human drama that made it impossible to turn away. Kody Brown sat at the defense table, outwardly calm on the surface, but with an easily discernible tension that revealed the seriousness of the situation. He realized that the testimonies about to be heard would not only damage his reputation, they would unveil the personal agony of his family to public scrutiny. The first ex-wife was summoned to testify. She moved slowly, with each step resonating through the hushed courtroom, her hands grasping the sides of the witness stand as if it were the sole reminder keeping her upright. Her gaze darted once around the room, catching sight of the press, the witnesses, and cameras before she trained her eyes on the future, intending to share her truth. She started speaking quietly, nearly uncertainly, but her voice grew stronger as she went on, above murmurs and camera clicks. I lived in fear and uncertainty for years. She started out, her voice shaking just enough to show the depth of her hurt. I trusted someone I loved to make us safe, to act responsibly, to keep promises that were designed to keep our children safe. But that trust was broken. As she spoke of her ordeal, the courtroom changed. Every word conjured up a graphic image of sleepless nights, financial stress, and emotional distress. She told of the nights spent lying awake wondering if bills would be paid, if her children would have what they needed, and if she could ever count on the person she once thought of as a partner in life. The audience could sense the gravity of her words. It wasn't merely a tale of money, it was a tale of broken promises, of the unseen weight borne by those left to clean up the mess. Each and every detail she recounted seemed to linger in the air, a portentous reminder that beneath every monetary disagreement lay actual lives, actual families, and actual consequences. The second ex-wife took the stand with a different kind of intensity. She was quieter at first, composed almost to the point of seeming stoic, but there was a sharp edge to her words, a controlled anger that could not be ignored. She spoke of betrayal, not just financial but emotional, and how it rippled through every corner of her life. It wasn't about the money, she said resolutely, her voice calm in contrast with the raw emotion of her tone. It was about the lies, the deception, and the feeling that my fears, my concerns, and my children's needs were not addressed. It seemed as though we were not there in the choices that made our own lives. The listeners in the courtroom were captivated, unable to avert their eyes, the anxiety growing with every word as though the walls themselves were drinking in the weight of her words. The testimonies of emotion did more than detail grievances. They unveiled the human toll behind the figures. Both ex-wives described heartbreak, confusion, and the psychological toll of functioning in a complicated family system but being unsupported. There were stories of waking up in the dead of night, sobbing, of pleading discussions about meeting the ends, of experiencing moments when hope seemed unattainable. These weren't complaints. These were lived moments, aghast and unvarnished, revealing a part of Kody Brown's life that the outside world never got to see. Kody listened gravely, keeping himself serene on the outside. But it was apparent that the pressure of these tales weighed heavily on him. He had spent most of his life in the presence of cameras, where scenes of emotion were edited or staged for effect. But here, there was no editing. There were no do-overs. Every statement, every hesitation, every look bore the weight of truth. He could see the effect these depositions had not only on the judge and jury, but on the courtroom crowd, the media, and even himself. It was a test, not just of facts, but of perception, empathy, and moral responsibility. The attorneys for the ex-wives posed pointed questions, directing the testimony to emphasize not only money mismanagement, but the emotional impact of Kody's choices. One of the questions concerned the effect of financial uncertainty on their children, and the courtroom collectively shivered as the ex-wife explained nights spent comforting terrified children, reassuring them that they would be all right when she herself had no idea. Another question illustrated the stress on wider family members, the ripple effects that went far beyond the immediate families. Every disclosure fleshed out the story, making what might have been dull testimony a gripping human tale of adversity, grit, and disillusionment. The spectators in the courtroom reacted subtly but decidedly. Some murmured to those around them, others scribbled notes, and a few shook their heads in stunned disbelief. Tension was no longer solely a legal issue. It had become a collective emotional experience. The testimonies of the ex-wives had brought the gap between abstract accusations and actual consequences closer. The room was no longer merely a site of judgment. It was now a stage for the human drama that had unfolded behind closed doors over years, only to be revealed now. The emotional burden grew heavier as the session continued. Kody's attorneys tried to maintain a balance, asking clarifying questions and introducing evidence to contextualize decisions, but the raw emotion of the testimonies often overshadowed these interventions. Witnesses described not just financial uncertainty, but the emotional toll of feeling unheard, dismissed, or undervalued. The stories were detailed, specific, and deeply personal, creating a tapestry of experiences that painted a complex picture of family life under pressure. The courtroom fell silent once more, except for the occasional sniffle or the scratch of a pen on paper, as everyone sat and let the seriousness sink in. One of the most powerful moments came when an ex-wife spoke of an occasion when she had called Kody out on missing payments for basic needs, to be met with perfectly logical-sounding explanations but left feeling invisible. Her voice cracked a little as she laid out her feelings of powerlessness, the exasperation of having to act alone to untangle a complicated situation, and the ongoing fear that her children's needs could be forgotten. The judge listened intently, taking notes, her face inscrutable but watchful. The courtroom was made to feel the heft of these moments, the intricacy of family life, and the emotional reality that sometimes supersedes legal definitions. By the time the session was over, the courtroom had been led on an emotional ride. The evidence wasn't just statements of fact, it was tales of human struggle, survival, and the suffering that comes with betrayal. The audience, both in the courtroom and witnessing via media reports, were unable to overlook the richness of emotion, the sincerity of experience, and the irreversible effect Kody Brown's choices had on the people around him. Even for Kody himself, listening to these tales being related so passionately was a reminder of the true life implications of his actions and decisions. As the witnesses excused themselves, the room still hung heavy with emotion. The press scribbled madly, desperate to catch every word, every inflection, every tear. Spectators murmured to each other, attempting to digest what they had just seen. And Kody Brown, seated at the defense table, breathed ever so slightly, a small testament to the emotional odyssey that had just played out before his eyes. The session had broken a new side of his life, one that cameras had rarely shown: the cost and humanity of choices, the burden of responsibility, and the complex, frequently difficult result of family dynamics exposed to public view. The lead counsel stood, documents in hand, with a serene command that commanded respect. "Your Honor," he started, voice firm, "though the charges brought are serious, there are important facts that have not yet been weighed." He nodded toward a pile of documents, charts, and contracts of law, well stacked and diligently prepared. "We have proof that explains some fiscal choices, and gives background that refutes the story put forward by the plaintiffs. The courtroom, once abuzz with emotional passion, was silent, the tension of expectation palpable. The first item of evidence was a series of fiscal reports, thoroughly annotated and cross-referenced with dates and previous approvals. The defense pointed to examples of money having been passed with the agreement of the families, proving that some of the allegations were based on misunderstandings and not lies. The courtroom hushed, heads leaning forward as people whispered to each other. The ex-wives looked at one another, surprise and doubt etched on their faces. The story that had been so clear-cut a minute before was starting to change, uncovering new depths of complexity. Next was a witness nobody anticipated, a previous financial advisor who had overseen Kody's finances. The advisor elucidated the complexity of running several households, legal requirements, and long-term budgeting. Mr. Brown has always acted with the purpose to bring stability, the advisor said forthrightly. Of course, there were problems, but considering the nature of the situation, each decision was made with consultation and approval where necessary. The impression of mismanagement doesn't fit the recorded facts. The courtroom gasped and murmured audibly. It was a shock that added an extra layer to the tale. The defense did not stop there. They produced signed contracts, email exchanges, and timelines that flatly contradicted some of the ex-wives' allegations. Payments had actually been made, obligations met, and some decisions agreed upon collectively. Facts that had heretofore been ignored or misinterpreted. The judge, scribbling furious notes, would sometimes look up at both sides, balancing the sudden deluge of evidence with a critical eye. The tension in the room escalated, as everyone realized the story was no longer straightforward. Kody himself maintained a calm exterior, though inside he felt a surge of cautious relief. This twist wasn't just about defending his reputation, it was about revealing the truth, even if it complicated the narrative for everyone involved. He had been prepared for the emotional testimony, prepared for the allegations, but the presentation of this new evidence brought about dynamics that no one could have anticipated. The court that had been filled with anger and frustration was now a platform for subtlety, strategy, and surprise revelations. As the defense presented the evidence, the attorneys of the ex-wives tried to contest the new allegations. There were objections, there were questions asked, and cross-examinations started, each camp striving to manipulate the facts in its favor. The courtroom was transformed into a theater of intrigue, every word carefully selected, every movement measured carefully. The tension swung between incredulity and curiosity, as onlookers struggled to comprehend the burgeoning complexity. What had appeared to be a cut-and-dried tale of deception was now uncovered as a knotty knot of choice, point of view, and interpretation. One of the most theatrical moments was when the defense entered into evidence emails between Kody and one of his former wives that showed foreknowledge and consent of some financial transactions. The emails were clear, containing dialogue that disputed claims of secretive or dishonest activity. The courtroom erupted in surprise, whispers spreading like wildfire. Onlookers and reporters both leaned forward, desperate to hear every word of this dramatic twist. Kody's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the increasing tension of the room. He had endured storms before, but the drama that was now playing out was something even he had never seen. The judge, clearly engaged, questioned the judge to help explain the newly submitted evidence. Every response shed light, disentangling some of the prior accusations while complicating others. It was apparent that the case was no longer a straightforward tale of good versus evil. Rather, it had become a subtle examination of intent, perception, and the frequently indistinct line between error and betrayal. The courtroom environment, previously suffused with one-dimensional emotion, now thrummed with an air of expectation and doubt. The press, feeling the change in narrative, leaned in hungrily. Cameras clicked relentlessly, and reporters scribbled furiously, knowing that this twist could redefine the story that had dominated headlines. Outside the courtroom, social media erupted as snippets of the testimony and new evidence were shared instantly. The public, previously forming judgments based on initial accusations, now had to reconsider. The surprise had plunged the case into a world of doubt, and there was a live drama unfolding which drew people well outside the courthouse itself. The defense continued tactically, producing evidence that portrayed Kody as consistent, responsible, and a planner for the long term. They pointed out that although there had been errors, they were insignificant compared to the betrayal story spun so far. Every fact contributed to the richness of the argument, forcing the audience and the judge to rethink assumptions and balance the facts meticulously. The courtroom had become a poised balance between emotional appeal and factual testimony, with each word tipping the balance ever so slightly in the direction of nuance over extremes. The courtroom was transformed dramatically by the end of the session. The first story of utter wrong had been interrupted, replaced by a nuanced, multifaceted image of human choices, financial subtleties, and emotional repercussions. Kody Brown had ridden out the tempest of insinuation, offering an unexpected twist, one which rewrote the conversation and called for greater caution in considering the facts. The tension still lingered, but now it was additionally smoothed over with intrigue, strategy, and the feeling that the story was certainly not finished. When the court recessed for the day, all present knew that the trial had reached a new chapter. The emotional witnesses had shocked the room, but the shocking evidence had recreated it. Kody Brown, used to being in the limelight, had been able to add a spin that evoked attention, scrutiny, and re-evaluation. The outside world, observing through media reports, social media, and live streams, experienced the ripple effect of this dramatic twist. Public opinion, which had appeared so set in stone, was now in turmoil. Exiting the courtroom, Kody permitted himself a calculated sigh. The surprise had paid off, but the trial was by no means over. There were still more sessions ahead, more evidence to be heard, more witness testimony that could tip the balance either way. The day had been a turning point, a lesson in how in life, and in the law, things are never quite what they appear to be. And for the world watching, it was a lesson in drama, nuance, and the surprising twists that render true-life tales unforgettable. After dozens of hours of testimony, evidence, and surprise revelations, the courtroom descended into a heavy silence. The tension that had caught everyone, journalists, observers, lawyers, and even Kody Brown himself, was tangible, as though the very walls were collectively holding their breath. The ex-wives had given their emotional testimony, the defense had laid out their surprise turn, and now attention was all about the most powerful figure in the room, the judge. Everyone's eyes were on her, as she fussed with her robe, a subtle but unmistakable message that she was ready to be heard. The gravity of the entire case appeared to rest upon her words, and the room held its breath, standing on the precipice of waiting. The entry of the judge into the proceedings brought with it an instantaneous change in atmosphere. Judges possess a manner of commanding attention that is nearly magnetic. It is not so much the robe and the gavel, it is the aura of authority, the anticipation of reason, and the unspoken reminder that within this room, reason and law are the absolute rulers. The courtroom, once abuzz with speculation, fell silent in an instant. Pens hung suspended mid-scribble, camera lenses snapped more intensely, and even the chattering onlookers sat taller in their seats. Her eyes swept around the room, encompassing each person with an intensity that was at once comforting and unnerving. At last she spoke, her tone firm but controlled, each word weighed and loaded with meaning. This case is complicated by family relationships, financial responsibility, and individual accountability, she began. Her gaze flashed briefly to Kody, then the ex-wives, drinking in their looks, their posture, and the underlying tensions in their positioning. The evidence and testimony that have been presented up to this point describe a situation that is complex, emotionally involved, and intensely personal. The courtroom was struck by the weight of her words. It wasn't a mere procedural recognition, it was a reminder that this case was more than mere legal argument, and stepped into the fragile landscape of human relationships. The judge paused, letting the weight of what she said settle in the room. Each individual in the room seemed to lean forward, consciously or unconsciously, drinking in the gravity of her voice. And then she went on, making clear the gravity of her role. As the presiding judge, it is my responsibility to carefully balance all the evidence, consider the views of all concerned parties, and that justice be dealt out impartially and fairly. Firm but just, her words touched not only those in the courtroom, but also the unseen audience watching the trial unfold through media reports. The courtroom collectively breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that the pursuit of justice, as slow as it was and deliberate, was being undertaken with diligence and care. The judge spoke to the emotional toll of the testimonies, accepting the bravery involved in speaking about personal experiences in such a public forum. "I acknowledge the emotional toll these proceedings have had upon everyone involved," she said. "Testimonies have spoken of financial hardship, trust being broken, and personal suffering. These statements are being taken seriously and will be given due consideration in conjunction with all evidence presented." The faces of the ex-wives displayed a mix of confirmation and relief. The acknowledgement itself, while not a judgment, was important. Kody too sensed the burden of responsibility in her words, realizing that the judge knew both the human and factual sides of the case. Her attention now turned to the new evidence, the surprise twist that had shocked the courtroom that morning. She spoke to the defense, her tone clear and unflinching. "The reports submitted by counsel for Mr. Brown will be fully examined. Any inconsistencies, contradictions, or confirmations of previous testimony needed to be scrutinized to assess their effect on the case." The chamber, which had once been swayed by raw emotion, now began to feel the transition to rationality, analysis, and legal examination. The crowd could feel that the trial was now at a turning point, where every shred of evidence could tip the scales and determine the verdict. The judge also cautioned both sides on the subject of perspective and intention. "It is crucial to understand not only action, but the intent behind the action," she said. "Family and financial choices are never made in a vacuum. They are guided by various considerations, such as communication, previous agreements, and the multifaceted realities of coordinating interwoven households." Her words highlighted a reality that both parties had to confront. This case was not just about blame. It was also about understanding, context, and equity. The courtroom sensed the fine balance between empathy and judgment, one that was impossible to resist for only a wise judge. The professionally measured pauses, and the calculated changes in tone that kept all on edge. This was no longer merely a trial. It had become a game of intellect, perseverance, and careful forethought. The courtroom was in a state of tension at one time when a dramatic new accusation came to light. A long-lost relative, unseen up to this point in the case, emerged with claims regarding monetary choices that had apparently been overlooked. The words hung between them like a heavy curtain, and an immediate increase in drama was sensed. Cameras snapped, reporters wrote furiously, and onlookers whispered uneasily to each other. Kody, keeping his stoic mask in place, took the shock in silence, aware that what he and his defense would do next could change the image of the whole trial. The defense quickly set about framing the charge in context, producing papers and records that disputed the unexpected charge. Emails, signed agreements, and extensive financial reports were placed with deliberation, each item carefully crafted to deny or justify the charge. The mood in the courtroom changed again, this time to a rich blend of disbelief, interest, and respect for the careful preparation. Onlookers could sense the seriousness of each word and paper, the solidity of each denial, and the subtle dance of strategy unfolding before them. There was added intensity when the judge had to interrupt several times to explain something, ask for further evidence, and remind both sides that they needed to concentrate on facts, not feelings. Her presence still filled the room, not with emotion, but with authority and logic. Each time she instructed or interrogated, each time she asked a question, added to the feeling that this was a trial in which accuracy counted as much as enthusiasm. It was no longer a matter of accusation and defense. It was the subtler dance of fact, perception, and human action under scrutiny. The day went on with a succession of tearful cross-examinations. The ex-wives, themselves calm, showed fissures in their story when confronted by paperwork, dates, and earlier accords. Their voices, before then having been full of certainty and moral outrage, sometimes faltered under the weight of evidence that made their accounts more difficult to sustain. Kody's defense, on the other hand, walked the tightrope of respect and assertiveness with equal care, speaking of openness and accountability, and pointing out the misunderstandings or oversights of the accusations. The tension in the courtroom was a coiled spring, waiting to snap with every question, every disclosure, every movement. One especially dramatic turn came when a bit of evidence disclosed a financial transaction that had long been misinterpreted by the plaintiffs. The courtroom gasped in unison, whispers rippling like fire. The lawyers for the ex-wives tried to dispute the new reading, but the papers were explicit and carefully drawn up. Kody, for the first time that day, granted a tiny controlled smile of relief, a fleeting recognition that the defense had scored a knockout in the credibility war. The crowd sensed the momentum shift ever so slightly, the tension building with each ticking moment. As the day wore on, the media chronicled every detail. Flashes from cameras, scribbled notes by pens, and hushed words provided an almost dramatic setting to the court case. On social media outside the courtroom, speculation, analysis, and debate exploded into millions of words. The spectacle of Kody Brown's courtroom struggle had moved beyond the confines of the trial, watched by millions who devoured every morsel with breathless anticipation. Every twist, every rebuttal, every emotional display was dissected and shared instantly, creating a living, breathing narrative that extended far beyond the walls of the courthouse. In the midst of high drama, Kody stayed focused, listening carefully to every fresh charge, response, and statement. His calmness was not indifference but deliberate management of presence and perception. Each nod, each subtle shift, and each pause was calculated, conveying alertness without alarm, assertiveness without swagger. The courtroom crowd, with sensitive ears, heard the subtle exchange between his face and the evolving story, a masterclass in maintaining composure under duress. The day concluded with a strong feeling that the trial had ventured into uncharted waters. What was once accusations and defenses was now a complicated weave of fact, perception, and feeling. Relationships, trust, and accountability were all placed under the microscope and analyzed with a depth that few could have ever imagined. The courtroom was now a crucible where personal history, legal arguments, and human emotion crashed into one another in spectacular fashion, with everyone, insiders and outsiders alike, on tenterhooks. With the gavel's fall, the day's adjournment was called, but the session's gravity hung heavy. The courtroom hummed softly with talk, reporters shared hasty notes, and social media dissected the melodrama. Kody Brown exited steadily, his aplomb intact, but the drama of the day was telling on him. The trial had reached new levels, and he was well aware that the forthcoming days would demand not only strategy, but patience, resilience, and a clear grasp of the stakes at play. The courtroom drama had become more than a straightforward tale of accusations and defense. It had evolved into a riveting, suspenseful epic of human passion, strategic tactical execution, and the lofty stakes of public and private responsibility. Each viewer could feel that the next session would reveal more emotional showdowns, and even more surprises that could rewrite the outcome. Kody Brown's life, his public image, and his family life were all woven into a tale that was by no means conventional. Each moment in the courtroom a possible watershed moment in an evolving drama that mesmerized the world. The courtroom was charged with expectation, the atmosphere heavy with tension, curiosity, and unvoiced anticipation. Following days of gut-wrenching testimonies, financial arguments, and strategic defenses, all could feel something monumental was about to take place. The media teams shifted in their seats, microphones at the ready, cameras pointed with precision, and reporters scribbled furiously, aware that whatever was about to transpire could reshape the entire narrative. Kody Brown, seated at the defense table, projected serene calm, yet inside, his brain whirred. This was the time that secrets, long hidden under layers of family intrigue and public opinion, would be revealed. The first witness was called, said the court clerk, and the room fell silent. It was a person who had been noticeably absent until this time, a former household manager, privy to the inner sanctum of Kody's sprawling, interconnected family. As she walked up to the stand, the whispers in the courtroom had reached a fever pitch. Everyone knew that this testimony could shed unprecedented light on the private life of a man whose every move had been watched, analyzed, and broadcast to millions. She cleared her throat, glanced at the judge, and began her account. "I've been part of the Brown household for over a decade," she began, her voice steady but tinged with gravity. "I've seen the intricacies of managing multiple families, handling finances, and navigating the complex relationships that exist within this unique family structure. There are things that have never been public, decisions that have never been fully understood outside these walls, and consequences that have silently affected everyone involved." The courtroom seemed to lean in collectively. The anticipation was palpable, as though everyone in the room could sense the gravity of the things that were about to be revealed. Her testimony started meticulously, detailing instances of planning, organization, and deliberate neglect. She explained how Kody had planned and coordinated with meticulousness financial responsibilities, seeing to it that each home was subsidized, even during lean times. The attorneys for the ex-wives bristled, ready to dispute what she was saying, but the evidence the witness presented was credible, backed up by documents, receipts, and exchanged communications. Every detail she provided depicted meticulous control, and an effort, if imperfect, on the part of a man to fulfill the gargantuan burden heaped upon him. Then came the revelation that actually shocked the court. She uncovered resolutions never before revealed, moments of concession and sacrifice that portrayed a degree of responsibility that few outside the family had ever witnessed. There were nights when Mr. Brown worked tirelessly to ensure that funds were properly allocated, she said. There were times when he personally intervened to prevent financial chaos, when he took on responsibility not always seen. These weren't ideal solutions, but they were efforts to keep things stable for all parties. The room collectively gasped, the weight of the unseen efforts now revealed. Kody's expression was still stoic, a tiny, barely perceptible nod suggesting relief. The testimony of the witness provided depth and context, balancing against the overwhelming emotional testimony of the first two sessions. This was not only about defense, it was about truth, subtlety, and exposing the human work that went into making tough decisions. The public in the courtroom and through subsequent media reports could sense the slight shift. The story was no longer simply black and white. Gray tones were surfacing, revealing a man working, sometimes stumbling, but continually trying to do his job. The lawyers for the ex-wives tried to discredit the witness testimony, citing inconsistencies or challenging her credibility. But the witness was ready, bringing supporting records that even more carefully verified her testimony. Bank reports, itineraries, and internal memos were arranged in a clear fashion, each item bolstering her assertions and emphasizing the intricacy of running multiple households at the same time. The courtroom was transfixed, hanging on every word, every document, and every subtlety, as the tale of Kody Brown's secret work unfolded before them. Adding to the drama, new email conversations and financial records were brought in by the defense that exposed behind-the-scenes compromises and deals. Some of the conversations indicated Kody brokering tough choices with his former wives, showing attempts at honesty, equity, and compromise. The courtroom crowd, already enthralled, leaned in even closer, understanding that the public story they had watched for years was incomplete, omitting struggles, choices, and efforts never made known. The emotional resonance of these disclosures was deep. Observers, journalists, and even legal team members themselves were forced to rethink earlier assumptions. What had seemed like negligence or incompetence before was now being framed as the product of intricate decision-making under intense conditions. The narrative of deceit started to be paired with a narrative of duty, resilience, and human striving, and a rich and engaging narrative emerged that no one in the room would ever forget. Kody's calm demeanor was starkly juxtaposed by the responses of some courtroom onlookers. A few let out obvious breaths, some murmured backhanded commentary, and a few just gawked, taking in the bombshells that were being revealed. Even the ex-wives' faces looked subtly altered, instances of shock, recognition, or contemplation, as they grappled with information previously absent from public debate. The courtroom, typically a room of rigid formality, had turned into a theater of human nuance, feeling, and discovery. One of the most dramatic points was when the witness revealed a series of personal compromisations Kody had made in order to guarantee financial security in every household. She explained situations where he had sacrificed personal indulgences, worked extra shifts, or accepted unexpected liabilities to safeguard the health of his children and family members. These were sacrifices that had been unseen by the public, covered up under the brightness of reality TV and social gossip. The courtroom nodded with audible gasps, a combination of disbelief, respect, and fresh knowledge. The media covered it all, every detail, every look, every nuance. Cameras snapped incessantly, journalists noted with hysterical vigor, and social media abuzzed with conjecture and analysis. The disclosure of these years of secret work altered the landscape, creating a dramatic contrast between the reality of private life and perception of public persona. For Kody, there was vindication and a sober reminder of the attention that had attended his choices. All effort, all decision, all personal sacrifice was now subject to scrutiny, open to interpretation and judgment by court and world alike. The session of the day ended in a state of wonder and contemplation. Secrets had been revealed, clandestine efforts had been exposed, and the intricacies of Kody Brown's life, personal and financial, had been exposed to all in a manner that few could have imagined. The courtroom hummed softly, a combination of reflection and tension, as all processed the heavy nature of what they had just seen. The trial had turned again, from accusation and defense to a deeper dive into human endeavor, motive and strength under stress. As Kody exited the courthouse that night, the burden of the day weighed on him, but there was also a quiet feeling of vindication. The secrets which had been revealed, the sacrifices which had at last been recognized, and the narrative which had started to balance accusation with context were the turning point of the trial. The story, far from ending, had taken a dramatic and surprising turn, one that would forever be etched into the minds of all who witnessed it, both in the courtroom and globally. The air was heavy with expectation. Weeks of testimony, emotional encounters, defensive strategies, and sensational disclosures had come to this moment. The verdict was near. Everyone in the room sensed the burden of history settling upon them: the judge, attorneys, ex-wives, reporters, and even Kody Brown himself. A hushed murmur circulated throughout the courtroom. Kody's defense team shared quiet nods, acknowledging the recognition of their arguments and evidence. The ex-wives' faces changed, a combination of tension and incredulity, as they processed the subtle tone of the judge's words. It was evident that the judgment would not be an easy assertion of guilt or innocence, or a monodimensional right or wrong. Rather, it would be a measured consideration of responsibility, work, and circumstance. The judge went on, explaining her analysis of the financial disagreements. Some allegations of mismanagement proved to be partially supported, she stated, her voice firm but equitable. Though evidence presented by the defense shows that a lot of financial commitments were met with oversight and purpose, and that some conflicts arose due to miscommunication or varied expectations instead of deliberate omission. The courtroom crowd soaked up every sentence, the tension weaving in and out of hope and fear, doubt and relief. Each phrase held the power to influence perception, both within and without the courtroom. She then touched upon the emotional aspect, recognizing the difficulties, stress, and strain for all parties. It is recognized that emotional repercussions have ensued these financial disputes. The court takes into account seriously the plaintiff's lived experiences and the intricacy of dealing with interdependent households. Where some complaints are substantiated, it is also clear that attempts to sustain stability and assistance were always made by Mr. Brown. Her statement was a tactful balance of acknowledgement and explanation, affirming the emotional burden while highlighting responsibility and context. Kody permitted himself a quick, measured breath. The validation of his efforts, along with acknowledgement of human frailty, was a muted triumph in the legal theater. But he was also vigilant. The judgment was not complete. The judge continued to balance things with great care, going through each allegation and counter-allegation methodically. She analyzed schedules, accounts, messages, and earlier undertakings, showing the great care needed to arrive at a just and balanced judgment. The listeners, following intently, could sense the gravity of her contemplation. Then came the anticipation moment par excellence, the announcement of results dealing with financial commitments. As regards the financial differences, the judge stated, the court holds that certain payments are due to the plaintiffs to correct specific differences, and acknowledging that other responsibilities were fulfilled pursuant to documented agreements. Final distributions have been determined by evidence and intent to ensure fair resolution for all. The courtroom exploded with silent tension, some leaning forward eagerly, others whispering to those beside them, and reporters writing frantically to record every word. Then the judge turned to wider considerations, stressing intent, responsibility, and continued accountability. This case is a reminder that communication, openness, and thoughtful action are essential in handling complex family situations. While errors did happen, the court acknowledges proactive efforts at minimizing damage and taking care of family members. In the future, it is crucial that parties continue to hold themselves accountable and negotiate constructively in order to restore stability and confidence. Her statements had weight and direction behind them, which reinforced that justice was not so much about punishment as it was about resolution, comprehension, and future actions. The judge concluded by looking at the big picture, with a nod toward the human factor that had controlled the courtroom drama. This trial has uncovered not merely monetary and legal issues, but the complex dynamics of relationships, trust, and human decision-making. All the participants have exhibited both resilience and vulnerability. The decision reached today attempts to strike a balance between holding accountable and acknowledging effort, recognizing the complexity inherent in family, finance, and individual responsibility. With the sound of the gavel's descent, announcing the conclusion of the verdict, the courtroom fell into heavy silence. Onlookers, journalists, and legal professionals grappled with the multifaceted decision, the combination of partial vindication, recognition of effort, and balanced verdict weaving a dense emotional brocade. Kody was steady, appreciating the understated victory in the measure of judgment, yet cognizant of the continuing burden that the verdict represented. Outside the courtroom door, the world responded in an instant. Social media was filled with commentary, analysis, and argument. Headlines highlighted both partial validation of accusations and acknowledgement of Kody's attempts to keep up with his complicated family obligations. The story, which had engaged viewers for weeks, had come to a turning point, combining legal resolution with human drama. The verdict was not simply about money or legal obligations, it was a story of accountability, resilience, and the delicate interplay of intent and consequence. For Kody Brown, the verdict was both a conclusion and a new beginning. He had endured blistering scrutiny, tearful confrontations, and surprise turns, and had come out with recognition of his hard work, ownership of mistakes, and lucidity about future commitments. The courtroom spectacle had challenged his stoicism, planning, and stamina, yet also unveiled a side of him hardly visible to the public eye. A man who grappled with intricate realities with stubbornness, openness, and resilience. The day was closed in a mood of reflection, closure, and guarded hope. Slowly the courtroom cleared, and broadcasters hurried to inform their viewers, while participants departed knowing life outside the gavel would go on, shaped by the lessons, responsibility, and disclosures of the trial. The verdict had hung like a specter over weeks of melodrama, and now having arrived, it left a complex tale of justice, human nuance, and the long-lasting repercussions of decision. The courtroom was empty, but the reverberations of the verdict persisted like a specter in the heavy air. Reporters filled their notebooks, cameras were powered off, and audience members emptied the courtroom slowly, but the electricity that had characterized the preceding weeks of theatrics didn't seem quite ready to let go completely. Outdoors, reporters overran the courthouse, providing live reports, analyzing every syllable of the judge's declaration, and hypothesizing over the implications on Kody Brown's private and public life. For him, though, the second of public judgment had barely begun to settle, replaced by a less brash, more reflective challenge, figuring out what the verdict really meant to his family, his obligations, and his own future. Kody exited the courtroom with careful strides, the blinding lights of the cameras firing off against the glass doors, and temporarily obscuring everything else from view. The media roared out questions, but he said nothing, instead concentrating on the bulk of the day. He knew inside that the drama of the courtroom had ended, but the consequences in real life were only starting. All of the choices he had made, all of the efforts he had expended, all of the missteps and all of the gestures of responsibility had been exposed to the world to see. The decision had seen some of his imperfections and appreciated his proactive measures to handle his family's intricate requirements. That balance was essential, but at the cost of a long journey, one that needed sustained care, attention, and responsibility. The ex-wives, each interpreting the verdict differently, had gone out of the courtroom with a mixed bag of feelings. For others, there was satisfaction that some complaints were vindicated, and for others, disappointment that not everything had been completely accepted. The decision, as complex as it was, echoed the fact that human relationships are hardly ever monochrome, and justice tends to take more than a straightforward determination of right or wrong. Outside, where they made statements to the press, they diplomatically phrased their remarks, pointing out both the acknowledgement of their struggles and the need to go forward positively in the interest of their children and families. For Kody, the fallout was personal and public. Social media networks erupted in response, ranging from support to denouncement. Media outlets picked apart every aspect of the case, noting the money settlements, the acknowledgement of effort, and the admission of errors. The reality TV star's fans argued about his character, his motives, and his actions, whereas critics grilled him for his choices and the intricacies of juggling multiple homes. The courtroom saga had not simply ended a legal fight, it had reoriented public opinion, obliging viewers to reconcile the man they had watched on TV with the multidimensional complex truth presented in court. Privately, Kody spent time reviewing the trial's lessons. Alone, he weighed the hours of preparation, the emotional confrontations, and the surprises that had controlled the proceedings. He pondered the ex-wives, the children, the attorneys, and even the hidden witnesses who had contributed so significantly to uncovering flaws as well as efforts. The trial had revealed weakness and imperfection, but it had also underscored resilience, responsibility, and the capacity to manage hard, complex circumstances. It was a reminder that life, just as the courtroom, is a mix of responsibility, compassion, and introspection. Perhaps the most significant understanding that Kody gained was that of transparency and open communication. Most of the issues that had come before the court had been trivialized, not just by negligence, but by miscommunication, assumptions, and different expectations. In looking back at these instances, he learned that open, clear, and honest communication could avoid him misunderstanding, establish credibility, and ensure stability even in the most intricate family structures. The courtroom had shed light on these lessons in a dramatic fashion, but they were lessons that were practical, long-term, and influenced every aspect of his daily life and relationships. The children were also at the focus of the introspection. Kody thought about how the trial impacted them, emotionally and socially, and the manner in which the courtroom exposure redefined the family story. Preserving their well-being was an even more pressing concern, as he came to understand that public judgment, media reporting, and familial conflicts could imprint forever. The decision brought concreteness to financial responsibilities, but also highlighted emotional support, stability, and presence, life lessons much more far-reaching than what was mandated by legal decrees. The ex-wives, for all the complication of their relationships with Kody, were also in a period of introspection. The trial had made them face not just financial imbalances, but the underlying emotional consequences of their common past. Some were comforted by the validation of their complaints, some by the credit given to Kody's attempts. In the end, the verdict and its consequences caused a reassessment of values, responsibility, communication, and the continued commitment to the children's welfare. In some sense, the courtroom had served as a crucible, refining a more open, if complex, way forward for everybody involved. Public perception was an ever-changing factor. The verdict generated debates, commentary, and discussion on platforms, indicative of the strong interest in Kody Brown's life and family situation. Publics balanced legal verdicts with emotional accounts, challenged judgments, revised assumptions, and developed new beliefs on the basis of the intricate stories told in court. For Kody, it was a reminder that public focus would persist, but that it was possible to weather it with candor, calm, and an insistence on truth. In the still moments after the verdict, Kody also thought about personal development. The trial was not just a legal battle, it had been an emotional odyssey, a battle with errors, and a proving ground for resilience. He thought about the importance of enhancing communication, taking responsibilities proactively, and being transparent. These were not just legal requirements, they were lessons of life, lessons that reinforced accountability, humility, and perseverance as values both in public and personal domains. The drama of Kody Brown, now indelibly etched in the public conscience, was over, but its lessons and implications would keep playing out. The judgment struck a balance between responsibility and the acknowledgement of effort, imposing responsibilities, as well as validation on everyone involved. But above the legal verdicts, the trial had revealed a human tale of depth, grit, and the complications of navigating relationships, commitment, and reputation. For Kody, the way ahead was simple: ongoing dedication to family, accountability in every decision, and contemplation of the lessons learned deeply in the courtroom. As the media attention persisted, Kody prepared to speak to his family and the public. He recognized that openness and honesty were key. A thoughtfully crafted declaration, with an emphasis on accountability, learning, and future responsibility, would help span the gap between courtroom resolution and everyday application. The trial had been a tense and public process, but reflection and aftermath provided the chance for growth, knowledge, and a more balanced, reflective way forward. Kody Brown's courtroom drama was, at its essence, a tale of human nuance. It was a story of error and accountability, emotional stress and fortitude, public attention and inner toil. The verdict offered juridical closure, but the introspection, learning, and application persisted far past the gavel. As Kody moved forward, he came to see that responsibility, communication, and considerate action were more than legal mandates. They were the keys to maintaining relationships, navigating duties, and dealing with the messy details of life, both in public and private realms. The courtroom doors eventually closed, but the narrative didn't end, nor as a headline, nor as a meme, but as a reflection on the fragile harmony of duty, diligence, and the human bond. For Kody Brown, the days that followed were an opportunity to rebuild, to learn, and to work through the continuing challenges of family, image, and self-discovery.